This is Nick Redding, and you're listening to PreserveCast, a podcast with a worldwide listenership that explores the broad world of preservation from every angle, from drones to mudlarking and everything in between. Now, let's get preserving.
The group I lead at Virginia Tech is called the Crowd Intelligence Lab. And basically, we're looking at all different applications of combining human intelligence with artificial intelligence, such as face recognition. Besides historic preservation, we're also looking at domains like preventing misinformation on the internet. And
is that of any value right now?
I hear that might be relevant.
Today, we're super excited. I am personally excited to be interviewing Dr. Kurt Luther of Virginia Tech. And we're going to be talking all about his work on the Civil War Photo Sleuth project. But before we get there, I'd love to talk to you about your background, Kurt. So where did you get your start? When did you develop a passion for Civil War history? And I guess especially like photo history. Where does that all come from?
Yeah, for sure. Well, I kind of grew up in a family of history lovers. My parents are both very interested in history, including the Civil War. They love antique collecting and stuff like that. So I kind of grew up in that setting. We made lots of trips to historic sites and battlefields. I grew up in the Pittsburgh area, so we made trips to Gettysburg and other battlefields in the area. And I just got a pretty good upbringing in Civil War history. And I carried that with me through school and college and so on. And then it kind of got another spark a few years ago in 2013, I made a trip to the Heinz History Center in Pittsburgh with my family. And an amazing coincidence, they had a Civil War in Pennsylvania exhibit, 150th anniversary. That's why we were going. But an amazing coincidence, one of the items on exhibit was a photograph album of soldiers in a particular company of Pennsylvania infantry that one of my Civil War ancestors was in. And I got really excited and I thought, oh, wow, what are the odds? Maybe there's a photo of my ancestor in there. And the museum staff was kind enough to let us open it up and take a look. And sure enough, I was looking at a photo of my own Civil War ancestor, the first photo I'd ever seen of him or anybody of that generation in my family. And it was really exciting. And that kind of kindled my own interest in Civil War photography. After that, I started exploring it and learning as much as I could. And one of the most exciting things I learned was that you can identify these photographs when they don't have names attached to them. There's amazing detective work that you can do. So I tried to learn as much as I could about this identification process, uniform clues and Civil War photography techniques and all this stuff. And increasingly trying to help other people do this sort of thing. So I was finding people online and online communities that do Civil War photography, collecting and research and trying to help them out. And as I got more familiar with this, I got an opportunity to write a column on Civil War photo sleuthing, as I call it, for Military Images magazine. And I've been writing that column since 2014. And we write about a lot of different things, but I write about different investigations that I've conducted. And I also write about the Civil War photo sleuthing community. And of course, I write about the software that I've been working on.
Yeah, so I definitely want to get into that and talk about the software and photo sleuthing and how this project is funded and all that kind of cool stuff. But, you touched on a little bit with Civil War photography, but before we get into those details of the project, maybe we can talk about Civil War photography a little bit broadly.
Yeah.
How widespread was it? How accessible was it? Do we have any idea of how many photographs were actually taken? I mean, what's the universe of Civil War photography out there? I think it might surprise some people. I feel like I have a slight understanding of this. Listeners know that I worked for what was then the Civil War Trust, now the American Battlefield Trust, for 5-6 years. So I know a little bit about this, and obviously have worked with Gary Edelman, who is very into all of this. But I'm just curious, maybe you can kind of give listeners sort of a foray into just how big this was.
Absolutely. So just like you said, Nick, this was everywhere. Photography around the time of the Civil War was about 20 years old. So it wasn't a brand new technology, but what was different was that it was just becoming cheap enough that pretty much anybody could afford to get their photo taken. And you also start to see some new formats emerging around this time that make photos more accessible. You see the tintype and the carte de visite, which is a paper photograph coming out. And these are more durable. You can put them in your pocket. You can mail them and they'll survive that process. They're lightweight. And all these things come together to make photography really explode in popularity. And then, of course, the Civil War breaks out, and all of a sudden, everybody wants photographs. People who are soldiers who are going off to war, they want to bring photos of their loved ones with them. Folks left behind on the home front, they want photos of their loved ones who are going off to war. And it's not just collecting photos of your immediate family. People, they wanted photos of celebrities, they wanted photos of friends, they wanted photos of their commanding generals and Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson Davis and all these people. They really were, I'll use the words of Ron Coddington, the Civil War photo historian, they really were the social media of the 1860s, quite literally. And the other quote that I love about photos from this period is from Oliver Wendell Holmes. He says, they were the social currency. They were the sentimental greenbacks of civilization. And, we still value, and maybe just as much or more so, photographs today. But I think it's amazing that 150 years ago, people were still, even then, they were really excited about this. They did everything they could to get their hands on photographs. Now, as for how many photos there were, it's hard to say for sure. A lot of photo historians think that just about every Civil War soldier, at least in the North, got their photo taken at some point. In the South, it was harder, of course, with the blockade. Southern photographers, there are fewer of them to begin with, but they're not getting access to the supplies and the chemicals that they need to really produce lots of photographs in the South, especially as the war progresses. You get a good number early on, but that starts to dwindle pretty quickly. Ron Coddington estimates that there's somewhere around 40 million photos that were taken just of Union soldiers, which is kind of mind-blowing. And if you imagine that just 10% of those actually survive today, hopefully more, but if even just 10% of those survive today, that's 4 million photographs just of Union soldiers that are out there in museum collections, in people's attics and shoe boxes in their basements, and all over the place. And I would love to know who every one of those photos is, but unfortunately, most of them aren't identified. Nobody really bothered at the time, for the most part, to write the names on the back of these photographs. They knew who they were. Their family members knew who they were. Bob Zeller with the Center for Civil War Photography, he estimates that there's maybe only 10 or 20% of these photos that are actually identified today. So that creates a pretty interesting challenge for us Civil War photo sleuths today, trying to figure out who these photos are.
Speaking of the folks today trying to figure this out, and I think this is a good place for us to kind of pivot over to what you're actually working on in the software and all that kind of cool stuff. But I don't know if we really got into what it is your actual academic background is in, because I think the way it says in your biography is that you were by courtesy a member of the history department, which I'm sure that has some specific meaning in academia that I'm not completely familiar with, but it sounds very formal. But what exactly are you when it comes to academia?
I wish I knew. Yeah, well, in addition to my kind of personal interests in Civil War history, meanwhile, I was pursuing my career as a computer scientist, and today I'm an associate professor of computer science at Virginia Tech. I'm based in the Washington, D.C. area. And as you mentioned, also have a faculty affiliation with our history department. My area of research is called human-computer interaction. So we're looking at how people actually use technology. And more specifically, my work looks at crowdsourcing. So how do we use the internet to allow lots of different people around the world to connect online and do cool things together? And for me, a lot of the times those cool things involve history. So historic preservation, history education, historical scholarship. How can crowdsourcing support these kinds of things? And that has taken me to a few different Civil War history projects. But one of these is the Civil War Photo Sleuth project, where I'm kind of bringing together my research expertise in crowdsourcing and human-computer interaction with my personal passion for history. And that's one of the things that makes it such a fun project to work on.
Yeah, it's interesting. So when PreserveCast launched, we were very focused, at least for the first season, just on the interaction between technology and preservation and where all of that is headed. And this is like a perfect return to that for a moment. And it's so interesting because it really is sort of like the next step for historians, and I'm sure that this scares some historians that are listening. It's like, oh, I have to be a computer scientist in order to be a historian, and I think the answer probably in the next 100 years is yes, you do, because there's not going to be as many, long 3-page long, letters written between people, but there's going to be a hell of a lot of digital resources to mine, and we have to figure out how to do that. So it's almost like instead of having if you have your PhD in history, you have to be fluent in another language. Maybe now that language could be some type of computer science language, or it should be. So anyway, so this is a good place for us to kind of pivot here and talk about Civil War photo sleuth. So we've kind of been moving around it, but what exactly is it? And maybe the best way to kind of lay this out is take us step by step through a photo and what this program has the capacity and the potential to do, and what it can accomplish.
Absolutely, sure. So Civil War Photo Sleuth, it's a free website that anybody in the public can use. I created it as in collaboration with Paul Quigley, who's a Civil War historian at Virginia Tech, and Ron Coddington, who I mentioned earlier, a Civil War photography historian and the editor of Military Images magazine. And my student, Vikram Mohanty, PhD student, is the lead developer. So basically, this website allows you to do a number of cool things with Civil War photos. First of all, you can search photos. If you're looking for photos of an ancestor or just soldiers of a particular military unit or from the state that you live in, you can just find photos from the Civil War era. Another thing you can do is add photographs to our database. And these could be photos from your own collection, ancestors, family members, collectibles, or these could be photos that are out there in other public archives that have not yet been added to our database. And the more photos we have, the more useful the site, of course, is for anyone. So you're sort of helping other people out. And then the third thing you can do that's kind of our bread and butter is actually identifying unknown photographs from the Civil War era. So here you're actually being the detective and trying to figure out who these photos depict. And the site uses face recognition technology to help support that process. So walking you through an example, you have a photograph that you've come across of a Civil War soldier and you're not sure who it is. You add a scan of that photo to the website and you describe what you can about it, anything you can see, any visual clues you notice, uniform details, and the rank insignia, the type of clothing that the soldier's wearing, if photographer's name or location is on the mount. All these things can be useful clues to help narrow things down. Then the website analyzes the face of the photograph, detects the face, and then compares that face to the thousands of faces that are already in our reference database. Right now we have somewhere around a little over 30 some thousand of these Civil War photos in our database. And it's looking for similar faces, and it's going to show you the search results of faces that look similar to the one that you're trying to find. But it's also going to filter based on those visual clues that you mentioned that you tagged earlier. So for example, if you noticed the soldier was wearing a Union frock coat or sack coat, that's going to eliminate possible search results of Confederate soldiers. If he's wearing shoulder straps of an officer, then your search results are going to be soldiers who were officers at some point during the war, including promotions and demotions, because we do have the full service records for all of the soldiers who are in the database. So if you find a match that looks promising, we have some tools that allow you to kind of inspect those photos carefully and ultimately reach a decision about whether or not you think you've got a match. If you do, you can link those photos together underneath that name. And from there on out, other folks searching for that name will see your photo as well as the original. And we're piece by piece trying to bring these puzzle pieces together and figure out the names behind all these photographs.
So I mean, this is fascinating. Do you have any really cool success stories? I mean, I guess this is a tough or sort of a critical question for a data scientist. Does it work?
That's a really important question to ask.
It's always important, right?
Yeah, because you are increasingly seeing people trying to use this face recognition technology as it becomes more and more accessible for these types of tasks. So the question is, does it work? So the good news is that it does work, and we have had hundreds of identifications at this point, maybe thousands of them, and they've been in both public collections and private collections. A lot of our users are Civil War buffs, so they may have their own collections of photos that they're trying to identify. But we also have lots of users who represent different cultural organizations, different museums and libraries and archives, and they want to know what's in their collections just as much as anyone, so they can interpret it, so they know what they have. Some of my favorite stories involve identifications for the Library of Congress. For listeners that don't know, the Library of Congress has an amazing collection of Civil War portraits in a few different collections. We were able to use the Civil War Photo Sleuth site to identify a few different images in their collection so far. One of them was an amazing tintype of an assistant surgeon, Francis Marion Eveleth of the 7th Maine Infantry. Beautiful image. Unidentified at the time. He's wearing his uniform. It's actually tinted, just amazing detail. We were able to match that up with a slightly different reference image, a carte de visite of this surgeon in the Maine State Archives. The best part is when the Library of Congress actually changes the item information to add the name and sort of confirm your theory. They've been very supportive of us in terms of being responsive to the IDs that we've been proposing and making the changes. More recently, I just wrote a column in the magazine about identifying another Library of Congress unknown image. This one was a glass negative. It turned out to be George Dare. He was a lieutenant colonel in the 5th Pennsylvania Reserves. The other soldier I mentioned survived the war, but George Dare was actually killed at the Battle of the Wilderness. We've done a bunch of other identifications as well for the New York Public Library, Massachusetts Historical Society, Ford Museum, all kinds of different places. But again, lots of private collections as well. And folks get just as excited, of course, about the photos in their own collections, maybe more so. And, also not just identifications. It's really fun to just see people finding photos of their ancestors. Maybe they don't have any photos at all, but they come in, they have a name in mind, they run a search, and all of a sudden they're looking into the eyes of a family member who lived 150 years ago, and they never realized they could actually, see what that person looked like. And I always think that, you just get so much more insight into who these people are by looking at them, the way they dress, just the look in their eyes, and being able to make that connection, as I experienced myself, just is really, really powerful.
Well, I just signed up, so I need to dig in and see if you have a picture of my bounty jumping ancestor who jumped the bounty twice. I come from good stock. So this might be a good place for us to take a quick break. And then when we come back, let's talk about the future of this and, applications perhaps even beyond the Civil War. And we'll do that right here on PreserveCast.
Sounds good.
Hey, it's Nick here, and I want to remind you briefly that your support is what makes this podcast possible. To keep hearing important stories like this one, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and follow along on social media at PreserveCast. You can also continue supporting the podcast with a donation at preservecast.org. PreserveCast is sponsored by the 1772 Foundation and powered by Preservation Maryland, a nonprofit organization that believes we all succeed when we all know more about our past. This is Nick Redding. You're listening to PreserveCast. Today we're joined by Dr. Kurt Luther, who is the brains and the muse behind the Civil War Photo Sleuth. Before we took our break, we were talking all about how this program actually works, the passion behind it, what got him interested in this, and sort of the application of computer science into history, public history, preservation, all those good things. And so what's the future of this? I mean, how long has it been around? You've talked about the success. Where do you hope that this goes? And then maybe beyond that, we'll talk a little bit about application beyond the Civil War, because obviously if it works for the Civil War, it could work for any other aspect of history and photos and all those sorts of things. So, where are you headed with this? What's the future of Civil War Photo Sleuth?
Yeah, so we launched the site a couple of years ago, August of 2018. We had an event at the National Archives building in Washington, D.C. So it's been around for a couple of years. We've made a lot of changes in the intervening years, adding new features, trying to be responsive to what the user community has been asking for. We actually have over 15,000 registered users on the site at this time. People have actually made accounts and been involved in the site, and that's super exciting. But it's a start, right? We want to get many more people involved, and ultimately, our mission is we want to identify every Civil War portrait that's out there, be it soldier, sailor, or civilian. We want to solve all those mysteries, and that's going to mean doing a few different things. It's going to mean we've got to grow our reference database for sure. So we have, as I mentioned before, somewhere around 30,000 photos right now, but that's a drop in the bucket. We're talking 3 million soldiers in the Civil War, participated in the Civil War, millions more civilians. We need as much as we can get. And so that's going to mean more partnerships with museums and archives and libraries that increasingly are digitizing their collections. And many of them have Civil War photos in their collections, but they're all siloed in different places, around the country and the world. So being able to bring those together in a centralized place where search results will bring all those things together would be really, really useful. And of course, when it comes to face recognition, you're only as good as your reference database. You're not going to find a match unless you actually have a photo that matches it in the database. We also have to grow our user community. It's, again, a great start, but we want to get lots of more folks involved. We'd love to be doing more events. You're probably familiar with transcribathons, as events where people go out there and host events for transcribing documents. We would like to do something like that, but for photographs and identifying and adding photographs to the database. Bringing people together to spend a day scanning and uploading and tagging would be super cool and super helpful. We're also adding continually new features to the site. Right now, we're working on a number of different things. We want to add support for group portraits. Currently, you can only add a photo with one face in it, and many Civil War photographs or group portraits could be, brothers or officers, staff of a company or a regiment, and we want to support that as well. We're very interested in a project looking at photographers' backdrops. They can be really informative as to the location where a photograph was made. Even if we don't know who the photographer is, we associate certain painted backdrops with certain locations, and that can kind of connect different soldiers together and tie them to specific locations and time periods. And we're also building out some more community features. A couple of directions there are we're trying to support some private projects where you can get a group of people together and kind of discuss a potential identification and the pros and cons before you put that out there in the world, to kind of make sure that you've got all the different T's crossed and I's dotted, and maybe folks will notice things that you didn't notice, and that'll help increase the overall quality of information on the site.
So there's just like unending amounts of opportunities when it comes to all this, and the technology keeps getting better too, I'm sure, every day. And it seems to me like there would be some type of, I mean, obviously this isn't the goal, but it seems like there would be some type of commercial application of this as well. I mean, I feel like at some point, and maybe that's where we can head, which is like, what are the other applications of this? It seems like an ancestry.com would want to have something like this just for their own, users, and maybe not just Civil War focused. It seems like there would be applications for this for, pictures of immigrants coming in through Ellis Island. And I mean, it just seems like there's so many other places where this could go. Are there other projects like out there like that? Is this being looked at by people who study different aspects of history? Because we have a lot of listeners who love the Civil War, but then there's a lot of listeners who are around the world who, the American Civil War is not their thing, and they might be thinking, well, this would be a great way to do something for XYZ historical period of time. What else are you seeing out there? What are the other applications for this?
Yeah, for sure. So I'd say that the uses of this technology are quite broad, even within history. We do get lots of folks inquiring with us about applying the technology to other historical periods, the Vietnam War, photos of the Holocaust, different periods in American history and world history. And I'm really interested to support as many of those as I can. Unfortunately, it is a lot of time and effort to set up one of these sites. It requires you to do a few different things. You have to customize it for whatever domain. So if it's the American Civil War, we're talking about certain types of uniforms, certain types of metadata that we care about. There's also a community building effort. You have to get enough people together who are going to contribute to growing this site, its reference database, and actually sustain itself. And that oftentimes means boots on the ground, going to giving talks and going to collectible shows and kind of getting the word out as best you can. And there's also tech support involved, of course. You have to be able to support this technology infrastructure and lots of people using a site simultaneously. So far, unfortunately, we've had to say that we can't help those folks yet. We just don't have the time. We really don't have enough time for our own site, unfortunately. I wish I had more hours in the day. But we're interested to figure out other ways to make the technology available. There is clearly a need and a demand for this. We haven't seen it fulfilled yet. I have seen a couple of other examples of, I guess, computer vision or face recognition type technologies being applied in historical context. There's one genealogy site that lets you use computer vision and deep learning to improve or enhance a historical photograph. I think it will colorize it for you, or it'll repair some of the damage. Another group of sites I've seen lets you tag faces that appear in photographs that you upload to genealogy sites, but we're not yet seeing anything that actually focuses on the face recognition to do identification work. So that's a need that I hope we can fulfill in the future.
And I guess as the technology gets more ubiquitous and easier to use and gets even better, the applications become even more profound. So you mentioned time in the day. What else, for people who are interested in your work, where can they find you? What else are you working on? Is Civil War Photo Sleuth take up all your time, or do you have other projects going as well?
Right. So we do have other cool stuff going on. The group I lead at Virginia Tech is called the Crowd Intelligence Lab, and we have a website at crowd.cs.vt.edu. And basically, we're looking at all different applications of combining human intelligence with artificial intelligence, such as face recognition. Besides historic preservation, we're also looking at domains like preventing misinformation on the internet and other types of applications. So
is that of any value right now?
I hear that might be relevant.
Maybe we could do a separate podcast on that. I'm not familiar with it.
Yes. Well, one of my favorite recent examples was combining my interest in misinformation and my interest in Civil War photo identification to debunk a photograph that was claiming to be Joe Biden's slave-holding ancestor. So we wrote, I contributed to an article in Snopes on that topic.
So it was not his slave-owning ancestor, I suppose.
It was not. Luckily, I was able to use Civil War Photo Sleuth to identify who the Civil War soldier was, and it was a completely different guy.
Interesting. So all these worlds come together.
Yeah.
So, final question, most difficult for anyone who comes on here, favorite historic place or site?
Yeah, it has to be Gettysburg. There's so much history there. The battlefield, the cemetery, the visitor center, the town, the college. I love it because it's the headquarters for Civil War buffs. And it's the only place in America you can reliably go into the McDonald's and see somebody wearing a Civil War uniform.
That's a good answer, and an appropriate and correct documentation of what it's like to go into a McDonald's in Gettysburg. So this has been a lot of fun. So cool. I feel like we just scratched the surface of this, and we'll have to have you back and kind of get an update as Civil War Photo Sleuth continues on in its work. And I hope listeners go check out the website, register, upload some pictures, poke around there, and see what it's all about. Kurt, it's been so much fun. Thanks for joining us today.
Sure thing. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to PreserveCast. To dig deeper into this episode's story, head over to preservecast.org for show notes and our collection of previous episodes. Don't forget to engage with this podcast by subscribing, commenting, and leaving a review. Follow along on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at PreserveCast for even more. PreserveCast is currently recorded in Walkersville, Maryland, and sponsored by the 1772 Foundation, and powered by Preservation Maryland. Thanks for listening, and keep on preserving.